Hello dear friends, how are you? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. Welcome, thank you for joining me here. I'm Ari Threger and today's video is yet another answer to a patron's question. And this one pops up quite a lot from time to time. And I've seen plenty of these types of misconceptions circulating on the internet all over the place, over and over again. So there's this assumption that Friday the 13th is both an auspicious day as a day for bad luck, but also a day with magical potency and therefore not only linked to magic, but a good day to perform magic due to its favorable vibes concerning supernatural powers, and that this has all to do with the Nordic goddess Freyja, because Friday is named after her, and the number 13th was a powerful magical number linked to Freyja and overall in all Norse beliefs and whatnot. And so Christians came after the pagans, demonized Freyja and her day, because this date was used for ritual sex magic, which is why it became a day of bad luck, because Christians were pretty bad. They didn't like pagans, they disrespected and demonized Freyja, they did not like sex either, which that part may well be true. Patriarchy against feminism and whatnot. For this particular case, that's all bullshit, right? Friday the 13th was never ever associated with Freyja, not seen, nor it has been seen or understood as a particular auspicious day for magic due to its connotations to this goddess and so on and so forth. So let's start from the misconceptions and suppositions concerning this subject and develop from there, and what we really know as uncertainty. This is actually a good example on how we humans are prone to find patterns where there's absolutely none and build a totally different alternative reality when we don't know the truth and origins of things, and then we just give away facts and alternative truths that are simply misconceptions and cherry-picked pieces of information to forcibly create what we wish to find and what we wish to be true. Let's be direct here. Historically speaking, regarding, of course, pre-Christian Old Norse beliefs, there is no connection between Freyja and the number 13th, right? However, there is a connection between this goddess and Friday. Although until recently, and some debate still, there was much doubt as to whether the name for this day of the week or the year derived from Frigg or Freyja. As I said in an older video in the past, there is no doubt that Friday comes from the name of this goddess Freyja, right? But that's all. This idea that Friday the 13th and Freyja are connected arises only from a neo-pagan perspective in modern spirituality, which uses this date as a celebration of the divine feminine, since Friday was named after the Norse goddess Freyja indeed, and they have taken advantage of the number 13 as being linked to the 13 lunar cycles of the year, 13 moons throughout the year, and therefore it has become or it has been considered a sacred number of feminine power and menstruation. So these modern ideas have led people to completely forget that this is a modern 20th century construction, and a few decades later people started finding patterns where they have never existed from a recent invention. And because of this, given the actual traditional idea that it's an unlucky day, Friday the 13th, they began to link it to magic and invented the story that Christians demonized it to somehow suppress the goddess and feminism, turning a day of magic and feminine power into an unlucky day as a way of demonizing an important day of worship in ancient paganism, which is simply not true, right? Something is invented, and shortly afterwards, an alternative reality of history that never existed is constructed from inventions and misconceptions. It's impressive how quickly people absolutely forget the very deceptions they create, right? It's funny. So, historically speaking, Freyja is indeed connected to Friday, because the name for this day of the week was named after her. And that's it. That's the only connection. Because of the idea that the number 13 is linked to the lunar calendar, which has 13 moons and sometimes 13 months, people believe, and its association with cycles of menstruation and fertility, modern neo-pagans made the interpretation that 13 was once considered a sacred number, not an unlucky one. Therefore, if it became an unlucky day, in modern spiritual perspective, it was believed that since this was supposedly a numerical evidence of the sacred feminine, then the day must surely have been demonized by patriarchal systems to suppress feminine power, particularly Christianity on its war against pagans, and so Christians associated this day to bad luck because of these reasons. But that's not what happened at all. To begin with, remember that I have done a video on the magical numbers within Old Norse belief systems, and what we always find are multiples of the number 3 and the number 3 itself. If you have the time, please do watch that video. The number 13 was not a thing within the perception of magic and sacred numerology, let's say, of Old Norse systems of belief. Furthermore, there's this belief that Freyja was the queen of witches, even though there's undeniable evidences of the goddess Freyja having been linked to Seidr as mostly a semi-shamanic divinatory art, and so indeed Freyja has strong connections to magic. This idea of Freyja being queen of witches is a late medieval, mostly modern conception that did not take root following the continental witch trials since the 15th century, in which there was this common idea that Diana was the queen of witches. And so even though this was a general idea for all Christendom, some nations, some countries, some realms have also tried to put a name of another goddess into the figure of Diana through the Christian lens on familiar goddesses' names of their own cultural and folkloric realities. One such case is Frauhol. And so to Iceland, in Iceland it was Freyja, but this really did not take root, and it's just a very small and almost unnoticed part of the conceptions of European diabolism of the modern period. This idea of Freyja as queen of witches actually gained more roots or more attention in our contemporary times due to a misinterpretation of a church painting in Germany. If you remember my video on witches in Scandinavia, you probably remember the thumbnail of that video, which are two images of a circa 12th century, 1300s Common Era depiction of a cloaked woman riding a large cat, which appears on a wall in the Schleswig Cathedral in Schleswig-Holstein from Denmark, now northern Germany. She was commonly interpreted as Freyja now in our modern times. She's also alongside another feminine figure riding a broom, also commonly interpreted or misinterpreted as Frigg. But this was a modern misinterpretation, as I said. There are Christian, these are Christian depictions of what we could perhaps call, or what could be called, proto-witch figures. These are representations of the stereotype of the witch in the Middle Ages. These are not representations of Frigg and Freyja or any other pagan goddess. Also, only once we see the number 13 within Icelandic literary sources, right? In the poem Lokasenna, in which this number is indeed implied, and therefore, due to the modern invention spoken previously, in this source there's a pattern that forcibly feeds into this idea of unlucky number 13 due to the banquet for 12 gods, where the uninvited 13th guest is Loke, and the very trickster spirit that caused the death of the beloved god Balder. This is not the case, right? This isn't the reason why the number 13 is considered unlucky, and it has nothing to do with Loke. And I take the opportunity to underline that these these literary sources are quite late when it comes to the pagan Christian Icelandic society, from a period when Christianity was very much part of Icelandic society already. We have two important points here. Greek classical myths not only played an important role as part of the mythological and cultural background and construction in the creation of Christianity itself, but also Greek classical myths were also translated into several languages by Christians in the Middle Ages. So it's no coincidence that in Lokasenna, this poem, the gods are presented as 12 in number, even though some of these gods in this scene, in this poem, were never actually worshipped by pagans. The person who wrote Lokasenna was well aware of Christian myths and religious conceptions and the introduction of the number 12 as an important number within Christian myths and religious scriptures within Lokasenna was very much on purpose to convey Christian religious ideologies and myths into the narrative of pagan gods and pagan motifs and magical numbers as well, to better facilitate the learning of Christian ideology and theology in a society that was rapidly making Christianity its official religion. And Lokasenna is a comedy. So it's a funny way and an amusing way to bring both of two worlds together. And here's something important to understand, which I've spoken about many times before in this channel in some other videos. There's always this idea that Christians came into Scandinavia to destroy pagans and paganism and implement by force their beliefs, and thus people absolutely lost their old religions tied to the land and whatnot, as if these Christians are some ethnic group or foreigners or something. There's always this very dramatic idea of Christianity in the north, but this is a modern perception of things twisted by ignorance of historical facts. Not only it wasn't as simple as that, that's also bullshit, right? And people are only focusing, perhaps maybe, on that historical event of the reign of King Haakon I, although rarely, because this idea of Christians destroying Scandinavia is more of a general conception of modern spiritualities, New Age spiritualities, particularly neo-paganism of Western society. Sorry. But surely, even if King Haakon I becomes a sort of scapegoat for this modern perception, because he waged war, conflict, battle, and persecution on people who did not want to fully convert to Christianity, which was one of the major reasons that led Norwegians into fleeing to Iceland in the first place. But those Norwegians were not just pagans, they were Christians as well, and people who, in their own systems of belief, had a hybrid religious perception which included both pagan and Christian beliefs. And they fled the tyranny of Haakon, a Scandinavian, right? He was a Scandinavian who was a Christian and wanted to finally implement a Christian-style monarchy. And things were not as simple as this, and he was in part very successful because most Scandinavians had been aware of Christianity for centuries, many of whom had Christian conceptions, values, religious ideology, and even biblical figures within their own religious practices and folklore turned to this religious hybridism. Scandinavians were well aware of Christianity since at least the 6th century, and more recent evidences have surfaced that show how indeed Scandinavians were very much aware of Christianity earlier than what we thought. Christians did not invade Scandinavia to convert everyone into Christianity. It was Scandinavians themselves that brought Christianity into Scandinavia progressively. Many sailors and merchants and Vikings had converted to Christianity early on to be able to trade with Christian kingdoms. And here's something hard for many of you to hear. Several Scandinavians maintained contact with the Iberian Peninsula for thousands of years. There's plenty of evidences of cross-culture between Scandinavia, especially Western Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsula since at least the late Paleolithic, probably earlier than that, all the way into the Iron Age. These trading and raiding routes were maintained up until the Middle Ages. When in the Iberian Peninsula there was the religious crisis of Christians fighting Muslims to retake lands, all through the 9th century until well into the 12th century, many Scandinavians had contact with the Iberian Peninsula to raid, to trade, later on to help in the wars against the Muslims. But here's what it's actually hard for some of you to hear and digest. Many Scandinavians, especially Vikings, before helping in the fight against Muslims, before becoming Christians and fighting in this holy war and making religious trips into the Holy Land, they have also converted to Islam to be able to trade with Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula and across northern Africa and in the Mediterranean. So things are not as simple as to say that Christians invaded Scandinavia. Scandinavians brought several religious beliefs into Scandinavia due to their contact by means of raiding and trading. The whole conception, as an example, the whole conception of Thor's hammer as a physical amulet to be worn was inspired by Christian crosses whom Christians wore around their necks. In Scandinavia, the same molds to fabricate, to make Thor's hammers were the exact same to fabricate Christian crosses and vice versa. The molds were the same and were fabricated by the same blacksmiths and jewelers. So it isn't strange to see quite a lot of Christian religious conceptions and myths and theological motifs within Old Norse and Icelandic literary sources, because by the time these were written down, there had already been a hybridization, a great religious syncretism between pagan and Christian religious conceptions centuries before. So Lokasenna, this poem and its 12 gods, is a representation of Christian ideologies. The death of Balder, as another example, is a beautiful mixture of pagan and Christian religious themes. There are several examples of using pagan motifs to convey Christian theology. One such example, which I've talked about here before, and I think it's a very good example of this, is the Gosforth cross from Anglo-Saxon England, Anglo-Saxon context dated to the beginning of the 10th century, which is one of the best examples of using Norse myths and religious conceptions to express Christian theology, myths, and biblical conceptions. To finalize this, all this to tell you that this idea of Friday the 13th being an unlucky date because Christians demonize this day due to its connection to Freyja and the number 13 being magical and linked to the feminine and whatnot, it's not true. This is a reinterpretation not based on historical facts but false patterns misled by a misconception turned as a date in modern spirituality as a time to celebrate the divine feminine, lunar cycles and feminine wisdom, and some of which are historical, powerful symbols, but they were not suppressed over time, they were not connected. It's just a lot of loose information cherry-picked to form an alternative reality. So, Friday the 13th as an unlucky date is a traditional Christian superstition since the early 14th century, more than 300 years after Iceland and mainland Scandinavia had become officially Christian countries. It is the date when the Knights Templar were arrested. The Knights Templar were arrested for the first time on Friday, October the 13th, 1307 by order of King Philip IV of France. These arrests were part of a campaign that would spread to other European countries, eventually leading to the suppression of the entire order. This is why it is considered an unlucky number and date, because it was a date that made the very foundations of medieval Christianity to absolutely shake. And the whole of Christendom was put to question. Friday the 13th, as an unlucky date, is linked to the arrest of the Knights Templar. Nothing more. It has nothing to do with Freyja. Perhaps on a future video I may talk about the Knights Templar, and particularly when they were betrayed and the aftermath of this event. But that really stays for another time, which is a subject I have considerably researched. I think this example presented here today on this video is a very good example on how misinterpretation and supposition gains life of its own, and then people created an entire alternative reality because they see patterns where there are absolutely none, because people cherry-pick loose bits of information to convey what they want to be true and real, or what they wish to find in the past to give authenticity to their own prejudices, desires, and convictions. Well, dear friends, I do hope this video was useful. Please do watch the suggested videos I have indicated throughout this very video. I think you can find them down below in the description of this video. I think that's all automatic now on YouTube. Videos of many of these subjects I have covered in relation to Freyja, goddess worship in the north, witchcraft and diabolism in Scandinavia, and such other subjects. My next video may actually focus on the case I've here presented of the Schleswig-Holstein church painting, which I have just realized I have never fully dedicated a study to that, and perhaps it would be good to explain that case to help understanding this one. I've actually made a study of it, a short study on my Patreon some years back. Anyway, let future me deal with it. My dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed today's video. May it have been useful. Send this to people every time they share a meme or something saying that Friday the 13th was linked to Freyja and Christians were mean and feminism and the goddess were suppressed because it was a day for ritual sex. And so Christians did not like that and demonized Freyja and this day and whatever else people made up. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.